So I think it's really important to acknowledge that deficit discourse doesn't discriminate, and because we get into this space where people who are not Aboriginal feel like we're bashing them, but it's not about that. It's about how do we engage in different ways and try and understand the assumptions that we have about a certain group of people, and trying to move forward with different approaches around that sort of stuff, because most of the assumptions that sit in and around Aboriginality at the moment is all grounded in deficit stuff. So it constrains any movement, any positive movement forward. So I think it's important to acknowledge that deficit discourse doesn't discriminate. Black people do it, black people don't, white people do it and white people don't.
So deficit discourses are disempowering patterns of thought, language and practice that characterise people in terms of dysfunction, failure, problems, lack, this kind of thing. And so it's really about discourses that focus on individuals and communities and the problems within, and ignoring those larger socioeconomic relations that people are embedded within.
It's kind of the blaming of Aboriginality for some of the big social challenges that we have with some of our families and some of our communities, and it's the blaming of Aboriginality that and the conversations that are framed around that. That's clearly deficit discourse for me.
Mm. The strength-based approaches are an alternative way of talking about and thinking about issues. They tend to focus on things like assets, resilience, strengths, culture, country, language, this kind of thing. And they have a lot of potential as a way of shifting the conversation, but they're not an antidote as such, because they can reproduce some of the same problems as deficit discourse if you're still focusing on individuals and communities as units responsible for issues without looking at those wider relations of power and inequality.
Yeah, and the other thing that happens with strength-based is that people, it constrains conversation, because sometimes people feel like they can't talk about the big problems, whereas deficit discourse is about talking about the big problems, but in different ways, in better ways to move forward in this space. So the strength-based can be manipulated into something that it's not, whereas I think the deficit discourse stuff, it cuts to it. It's how you frame your conversations, what assumptions you have about certain groups of people, and then that all starts to play in policy development.
So we've now got a new phase of the project, which is looking at two things. It's looking partly at deficit metrics and the ways in which they can be reframed in more positive terms. So, if we look at something like closing the gaps, there's a prevalence of deficit metrics that are comparing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the aggregate to non-Indigenous Australians. And in the measures that are selected in these reports, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people appear to fall short of this kind of benchmark of supposed normality, right? So researchers at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the ANU are looking at ways that those statistics can be reanalysed to tell different stories. That's one strand of the project. The other strand that we're doing at the National Centre for Indigenous Studies at the ANU is actually working with community-based health organisations, looking at how deficit metrics affect their work, what they're doing in terms of strengths-based approaches, and what can be done to support their work more in future.